As more and more people transition towards plant-based diets, we need to consider possible nutritional deficiencies, particularly vitamin B12. And to discuss this topic with me today is Dr. Amanda Benham from the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Dr. Benham, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Dr. Benham, in your study with over 1,500 women of reproductive age in Australia that were on a vegan diet, you found evidence that having an inadequate intake of vitamin B12 was very common, so over 25% of participants. Can you first tell us why vitamin B12 is so important and why many vegans are risking deficiency?
Yes, happy to answer that. But before I do, I'd just like to make it clear that I think it's good news that more people are moving towards vegan and plant-based diets because other researchers have found some clear benefits from eating that plant-based diet, both to human health and environmental health. So it's no surprise that there's a trend in that direction. And as you mentioned, I think it's really important that people don't experience any negatives from plant-based eating, such as nutrient deficiencies, so they can get all the benefits without any negatives. So the reason I chose to look at B12 intake in people on vegan diets is because vitamin B12 is an essential nutrient that's not really reliably available from plants. So people eating a plant-based diet do need to be aware of it, as they are at greater risk of deficiency. Research has shown that not only vegans but also vegetarians who might eat dairy products and or eggs have been found to have a higher incidence of deficiency than omnivores. Now, avoiding vitamin B12 deficiency is actually very simple, but those that don't take steps to avoid deficiency may suffer consequences which can be severe. So this is because B12 is involved in DNA synthesis, so a deficiency can ultimately affect every cell in the body. So because of this, it can present in a variety of ways, making it very difficult to diagnose from symptoms alone. For example, deficiency can cause damage to the nervous system, including the brain. Now, this can result in things ranging from numbness and tingling in the extremities to paralysis, blindness, deafness, impaired brain function, and mental health issues, including psychosis. So it can be very serious. Deficiency can also manifest as skin conditions, as gastrointestinal disturbances, and megaloblastic anemia, which is a type of anemia where the red blood cells are larger than normal. This doesn't always occur though. So if deficiency goes undetected and untreated for some time, damage to health can actually be irreversible. So it's obviously very important that people are aware of this. And if a woman doesn't have an adequate intake of vitamin B12 around the time of conception, it can result in neural tube defects and other birth defects. And if intake is inadequate during pregnancy and lactation, infants can become deficient. And this can result in growth failure, seizures, problems with physical and intellectual development, and even death. So this is the reason I chose to look at B12 intake of women of reproductive age who were vegans, because poor intake in this group can impact not only the women themselves, but also their babies.
Dr. Benham, can you also tell us more about the study's key findings?
As you mentioned, over a quarter of the participants in the study had intakes of B12 below recommended. So we looked at intake from both fortified foods. Now, fortified foods are foods that have vitamin B12 added, and which foods are allowed to have B12 added and how much can be added does vary from country to country. And we also looked at intake from vitamin B12 supplements. And we found a few things. We found that although most participants did consume fortified foods, only 11% got enough from vitamin B12 from food alone. And this was mostly from plant milks and meat analogues that had added vitamin B12. So it seemed that at the current intake of these foods and the current fortification levels in Australia, people are unlikely to get enough B12 from those foods. So almost 3/4 of participants took vitamin B12 in supplement form. The type and doses of supplements really varied a lot. So some took B12 in the form of cyanocobalamin, some took methylcobalamin. There's just different forms of B12 you can buy. Some supplemented every day, some once a month or less, some use tablets, some use injections, and about a quarter didn't supplement at all. And what we found was, not surprisingly, that supplementation was found to be the greatest predictor of meeting the recommended intake of vitamin B12, because it's not that easy to do from fortified foods in Australia in any case. So we use an analysis called Logistic Regression to determine the predictors of supplementing. And we found that participants who took other supplements besides vitamin B12, who had food security, meaning that in the past year they hadn't ever run out of food and not been able to buy more, used iodized salt, had a BMI below 30, meaning they were not categorised as obese, and ate the recommended amount of fruit and vegetables, and were aged over 35 years. So these people were more likely to supplement with vitamin B12. So this suggests that the vegan women who are more health conscious, because many of those behaviours are related to health, were more likely to take vitamin B12, and that targeting younger and less health conscious vegan women could be a useful strategy to aim to increase rates of supplementation. So the study involved an extensive online survey. So as well as looking at B12 intake, we actually looked at some other characteristics and behaviours of participants. So I'll tell you a little bit about these, because it helps you to understand a little bit more about the characteristics of the vegan women. And no studies have really ever been done in Australia looking at vegans in this way. So we looked at their reason for adopting a vegan diet, and 68% was out of concern for animals, 21% was to improve health, 7% for environmental reasons. They were the three main reasons. There were only 4% that had other reasons, such as religious or aesthetic reasons. 12% of our participants had given birth since adopting a vegan diet, and nearly a quarter had children under their care. And the children with the participants with children, of those, just over half reported feeding their children a vegan diet all of the time. So that's something else to be aware of course, is that so many people adopting plant-based diets, which, as I said, I think is definitely a move in the right direction. But we have to be aware of the health of the children as well. And 18% of all the participants had actually had vitamin B12 deficiency in the past, which I think is fairly high. 2/3 has had a blood test or intended to have a blood test in the next 3 months to check their vitamin B12 status. And I think this last finding suggests to me that participants might have been over-relying on blood tests to detect deficiency rather than being actually proactive and taking action to prevent deficiency. And there are problems with relying on blood tests, because by the time a deficiency is detected, irreversible damage can have been done, especially to the nervous system. So it's really not a great strategy to just rely on testing. It's better to be proactive with B12. The other thing we looked at is we looked at some health characteristics and behaviours of participants and we compared these, our participants, to the general population in Australia, women of comparable age. And what we found was the vegans were more likely to have completed high school than the general population, and they were more than twice as likely to have completed postgraduate education. As far as their weight goes, vegans are more likely to be in the healthy weight range. 30% were overweight or obese. This is compared to 50% of women of comparable age in the general Australian population. So I think the myth of the very underweight, all vegans being, skinny and pale isn't necessarily true. And vegans were half as likely to be smokers than women in the general population. And as far as their fruit and vegetable intake went, they were almost 5 times as likely to meet the recommended intake. But however, that's coming off a pretty low base, as only 7% of adults in the Australian population meet the recommended intake of vegetables, compared with 37% of the women in our study. So I think that summarises the main findings related to B12 and then also, as I said, the characteristics and demographics of our participants.
And you do write in the paper that an individual who is ostensibly meeting the recommended intake of vitamin B12 may supplement via supplements, may in fact be at risk of deficiency. So when supplementing B12, what advice do you maybe also have in addition, or what should vegans or vegetarians look out for?
Okay, I think the first thing to understand is the recommended intakes are based on food, not supplements. And that's where a lot of people get confused. So, for example, the recommended intake is 2.4 micrograms per day in the United States and Australia. I think it's a bit higher in most European countries. But this doesn't mean that if you have 2.4 micrograms once a day from a supplement in a multivitamin, that you'll necessarily get enough B12. In fact, you most likely won't. And also the amount that can be absorbed at one time is very limited. So let's say you take 1,000 micrograms. It's no point thinking, oh, hang on, if I divide that by 365 or whatever, this is enough for a whole year. I don't need to take it for another year or something. That's not correct, okay? So my maths is probably a bit out there, but you can see what I'm saying. So it's actually better to take lower doses more often than higher doses infrequently, because we're not going to absorb all that we take in the dose, okay? So what I recommend is that everybody on a vegan or vegetarian diet should supplement regularly with vitamin B12. And it's best to start doing this when you adopt your plant-based diet, not relying on blood tests or wait for your reserves to run down or symptoms to appear. As I said before, by the time symptoms appear, irreversible damage could have been done to your health. And as far as the type of B12 to take, research has been mostly done on the form called cyanocobalamin, form of B12. So this is the recommended form to take, unless you're a smoker or have kidney failure, in which case a different form is recommended. So it's always in the fine print when you buy B12 what form it is. It's just that there hasn't been a lot of research on some of the other forms, and they might not be as stable in supplement form. B12 is best taken in a standalone supplement, as some of the nutrients in a multi-nutrient supplement, such as a multivitamin, have been found to actually react with the B12 and turn it into an inactive analog form. So nutrients that can do this, include thiamine, vitamin C, and copper. So basically what that means is you might think that you're taking your B12, some multivitamins here have 200 micrograms of B12, which sounds like a lot, but if that's getting converted into inactive analog forms, the actual danger of that is those analogues compete with true B12 for uptake, but in a blood test of serum B12, they will show up as if they are B12, so that they could actually not only prevent detection of a deficiency, but they could also cause a deficiency because they're competing with true B12. So we don't want that to happen, okay? Because then that's confusing. Someone could be deficient, but their blood test might show they've got a high level of B12 in their blood. So I do recommend that most people on plant-based diets get in the habit of supplementing with B12 every day. It's been found that if you do something every day, you're less likely to forget. So I know that some people might say, oh, well, it's fine to supplement a high dose once a week. In theory, that could be okay. But from my experience, and I've consulted with literally thousands of vegans in the 30-odd years I've been practicing, is that people start to forget after a while. Whereas if they do it every day, they're less likely to forget. And that's been found with other things, medications, etc. as well. So the confusing thing is, though, that most recommendations for B12 supplementation for vegans range between 50 and 250 or sometimes even 500 micrograms per day for adults. Now, that is a little confusing. I've even seen lower recommendations, which I think 50 would be a minimum from my point of view. And I think this reflects the wide variation in absorption rates between individuals. Different medications and disease conditions can affect absorption of B12. And also there's a lack of certainty of the optimal dosage rates due to lack of research, basically.
Dr. Benham, again, my thanks to you for taking the time. Let me wish you all the best for your further research. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.